if that's important, how it's important, when we need to start in terms of getting to it?
To be fair, it's actually really difficult to do. I mean, the Americans pull it off every 4 years, and that's, I guess, the model that we're kind of trying to establish here. But with minority governments, which has become the norm in Canada rather than the exception, it is a bit more of a challenge. So again, multi-party consensus and working together is going to be really important in order to keep that 4-year purpose. But I think it's one of our favorite parts of the policy. Like at the CDA, we're really happy with the idea that every 4 years, Canada will take a moment to reflect on these things. And it takes a year or two sometimes to get to the place where you can publish a policy update. So that means that if you're doing it every 4 years, you're practically doing it all the time, which is exactly where Canada's thinking needs to evolve to. Like we tend to put this off. And I mean, the DPU is a good example. It's 2 years late, but arguably it could be very well 4-6 years late relative. Like if we had been doing it this way, we wouldn't have waited for 7 years between two.
Thank you, Ms. Madison. Colleagues, we've got 25 minutes worth of questions to squeeze into 8. So this is going to be a 2-minute round. Mr. Kelly.
Thank you. I guess to any of our witnesses, this DPU speaks of exploring different options. That's the theme throughout. It name ticks a few things that are known capabilities we need, submarines and many others, yet without actual specific declarations of what the intent is. Is this even a policy update at all? I mean, to say that you explore options, that's only a change in the government's policy if the previous policy was to not consider options. Maybe your comments on the lack of specificity around actual policy changes or updates.
So I think that noting that things are needed but not actually providing any money to acquire them is a significant problem. I mean, the policy does make a number of actual commitments of funding, enhanced maintenance, more spending on infrastructure, and some investments in some new capabilities. But as I said, I think it's highly problematic to say we need these things but provide $0 to actually acquire them.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Cormier.
There's some elements that are like some of the most urgent elements too, like on housing. That's the one that really struck out. Like when I saw the housing numbers, and we hear of people who are living in campers outside certain bases, or have people have a hard time kind of bringing their families or leaving the forces because it's too hard on the families because of housing. And you see the numbers, and year one, there's practically zero new investment. Year two, $1 million or $2 million. Like you can build how many houses with $1 million? So that is one of the huge shortcomings here.
Okay, and so let's talk about the expeditionary capability. Is there anything in this? Is this DPU going to enhance Canada's expeditionary capabilities? You mentioned that, Mr. Cormier, so go ahead.
I'll start briefly. It doesn't say enough about expeditionary capacity and what the Army can do. But to be fair, there's a lot of investments here that can have multiple use, so you could actually leverage them towards expedition as well. Dave?
I'd say yes, but very unclear for the Army.
Yeah, that's the only thing I would just double click on. And first off, if the government doesn't have every answer on every question, then it's hard for them to actually, they want to say it, so they'll put, we're going to explore that. And if they don't have every single answer, they're not going to be able to provide that because we would reasonably expect that. But to close, there are a pretty wide range of things that are being considered in the policy as funded and to be explored.
Thank you.
So I think
Sorry.
No worries.
I really enjoy cutting off admirals. Mr. Collins, 2 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. The DPU talks about a changing character of conflict, right? There's more references to cyber and cyber attacks in this document than ever before. It talks about and addresses misinformation and disinformation, and what others are doing in the world to disrupt our institutions here domestically, as well as those with our allies. Can I get your thoughts in terms of, I was going to turn to you, Mr. Cormier. You talked about over-politicized national security. I'm fascinated with what's happening south of the border in terms of the Republicans and where they're going with Ukraine. There seems to be a split caucus there in terms of, I think some of that misinformation and disinformation is working quite well in the United States. It's happening here as well, of course. The leader of the opposition has pulled his support for Ukraine, and there's this quest to try to get as many people in the tent on the right side of the political spectrum as possible. And much of that's being driven by misinformation and disinformation on social media. So can I get your thoughts in terms of how the DPU addresses that and where we're going with that issue?
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Chairman? I just couldn't hear one of the words that Mr. Collins said. He said something about the leader of the opposition and support for Ukraine. I didn't hear the word in between.
Yeah. I think that his lack of support, no support for Ukraine.
Hold, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I get?
Go ahead.
I think the witnesses heard the question.
Yes.
So two things. First of all, that's one of the things that I thought was very well done in the DPU is the description of where the world is at in terms of the risks, and I think on that level, it's very well presented. With regard to Ukraine, I think it's really fundamental that we all recognize that if Ukraine loses, the world is a much less safe place in the future, because it tells those who are seeking to disrupt the status quo that this can be done in imperial ways just by taking over your neighbor if you see fit, and no one is necessarily going to hold you to account and push you back. And I think that what happened with the first war in Iraq against when they tried to invade Kuwait, there was a sense of the world will not tolerate annexation in this way. And even though the Americans went into Iraq years later, there was never a sense that Iraq would become an American state. It was not a war of annexation. Once you start allowing that to happen, it gives other states a lot of ideas. And I don't think we want to live in that world. And I think Canada has probably the most to lose as a medium-sized player in a world that doesn't have rules.
Thank you, sir.
The only brief observation I would make is there's a nexus between a national defense review and a national security review. And so when we discuss issues of information, misinformation, coercion, and the like, that's where there's an interplay between those two processes.
Thank you. Ms. Normandy, 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Both of you referred to the importance of increasing the number of missions, because apparently we are not meeting the mark at this point. No contracts have been signed by the government with any of these enterprises, although in the U.S. they are doing this. They've signed a contract to increase production. Are we not actually having a problem at the local level by doing so?
My translation's not working, but I think I caught the gist of that. I think we have been far too slow to actually put in place real mechanisms to leverage Canadian domestic production for a whole number of things, including ammunition. We've been spending a long time talking about that, and we need to get contracts in place.
And we need to achieve that in the long term, a defense industrial policy that makes sense, that has long-term projections required, and it's something you cannot surge. You cannot surge defense industrial capacity. It has to be planned for and paid for in an enduring way.
Thank you, Ms. Normandy, and Ms. Matheson, 1 minute.
You talked about this multi-party, nonpartisan sort of commitment moving forward, and yet you're also stressing the 2%. Is it concerning to both of you that none of the party leaders in any of in this group or future have ever committed to 2%?
Yes.
And is it? You also said that the world will not accept annexation. And yet that we see that that's not true currently in the Middle East. Can you explain your commentary in relation to that?
So it's early to tell if the annexation is the purpose or the removal is.
Is the defense of natural resources the purpose?
I wouldn't be able to say.
Okay, that's fine.
It's all right? Okay. Ms. Gallant, 2 minutes. Yeah.
Thank you. With respect to the strong and free, the DPU, even if we purchased all the equipment, as you say today, we are still short of the people to man them. As we heard, 70,000 people, yet only 4,000 were accepted and made it through. Have you done any studies that would suggest, or done any studies at all, about the relationship between the implementation of DEI in our military and the resulting recruitment numbers?
I haven't personally done research in this area. My colleague Charlotte has, but I would offer that the recruiting seems to be working quite well. We're getting tens of thousands of Canadians and permanent residents interested in employing and joining the military. We just can't get them in and employed.
Okay. With respect to the OECD and our GDP increasing, making the contribution to NATO as a percentage thereof even less, where do you see that we could get the most wise and effective spending completed were we to actually decide and get serious about security in this nation and allocate the money?
I would say procurement and personnel reform. There's plenty of money on the table. If we could spend that more efficiently and effectively, our numbers could increase significantly, and that's the most meaningful thing we could do in the short term.
This may be for our Admiral. I understand that there's been a planning group underway for a number of years with respect to submarines. And even if we made the decision, it would still take 8 years to get our first submarine delivered at best. So my question is, how long, once the military is eventually given the go-ahead, will it take for them to even decide what we will get in terms of a submarine, and then we can add on the 8 years to that?
I guess in some cases...
Excuse me, Admiral Hago. That may be an important question, but Ms. Gallant has gone through her time, so you'll have to work in an answer at some other point. Final 2 minutes is Madame Lalonde. And before I ask Madame Lalonde for 2 minutes, can you explain the lights, Mr. Those were just...
Yep, the House was suspended and now it's back, so it's just calling members back, so
Okay,
we're all
okay,
good.
so we don't have to worry about it. Okay, Madame Lalonde, 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try to be as quick as possible. So we heard a lot at committee today, and certainly about the defense policy update, focusing on the defense of Canada here at home. The defense policy focused a lot on the North and the Arctic. What's the significance of this, and why is this the right moment to focus on our Arctic? If I could hear both of you, and actually the three of you possibly.
Well, I'd give 2 little points. I think that the Americans are looking to us to show more leadership and vision for the Arctic, so I think it's a really good point for improving Canada-U.S. relations, check mark. And I think that when it comes to communicating to Canadians the importance of spending on the military, reminding them of the White North is pretty important.
I would offer that I think that's the most pressing threat to Canada, and if we want to look at where we can focus, and I think we should be focusing more, because we're not spending enough to do everything, that we should protect our own backyard first and foremost, and the Arctic is our backyard.
Closest point of approach between Russia and Canada is through the north. Contested United Nations claims for resources in the north. Our relationship with Indigenous peoples, governments, and communities, key in northern portions of Canada. So all positive reasons in addition to what my 2 colleagues have said.
And very quickly, what are our NATO allies doing on NATO's northern flanks, and how can Canada meaningfully contribute?
It's already a big contribution to open.
7 of 8.
Sorry,
Yuri, just 7 of 8 polar countries are NATO countries. So we are collaborating in a different and more meaningful way over time. Over to you, Yuri.
I was going to say that there's a bit of a transition, and it's a nice thing to hear from the Canadian government that there's a willingness to engage NATO in the North. We used to be much more protective of our North and not wanting to kind of share responsibilities with NATO. Presenting this as the northern and western flank of NATO is an important step in the right direction for cooperation.
We're out of time, but because I'm such a nice fellow, Mr. Perry.
I would say at present we can do very little since we have almost no modern military capability we can send to our north. Hopefully we get some soon.
Thank you all, colleagues and witnesses alike. I apologize for cutting you off at the beginning and cutting you off at the end. It's pretty frustrating given these realities that we have to deal with. So on behalf of the committee, I just want to thank you. With that, we'll suspend for a minute or two and re-empanel and hopefully get somewhere through our second hour. So thank you again. Meeting suspended. This meeting is now resumed, and we have two familiar witnesses with the committee, Dr. Sharon and Dr. Bouteille. We are really hard pressed on time, and so I'm going to just ask you to have, if you will, 3 minutes of your opening remarks. I apologize for this, but it is what it is. We're in the last week of Parliament, and and things happen. So with that, I'm going to ask Dr. Sharon, who's been waiting patiently, if she can summarize her remarks in 3 minutes, and then move to Dr. Bouteille, and then we'll have to shrink the rounds of questions as well. So, Dr. Sharon, please, 3 minutes.
Thank you for the opportunity to present to the committee. I would like to focus my remarks on Joint Task Force North, the Rangers, and if time permits, clarification regarding multi-purpose projects, given the Arctic-focused Our North Strong and Free, or ONSF. While I disagree with the idea that Canadian sovereignty is at risk, I do agree that defense and security in the Arctic needs to be assessed and a whole-of-government approach needs to be taken. JTFN is unique in that it is responsible for the largest geographic region of any of Canadian Joint Operation Command's 6 regional joint task force. Yet contrary to the others, it is only a force employer, which means that any sizable military activity conducted in the north requires troops and equipment to be force generated from the south. And unlike the Canadian Army divisions or RJTFs that have the benefit of being able to pick from large pools of members of all ranks, JTFN's main headquarters in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, and its 2 detachments in Whitehorse, Yukon Territories, and Iqaluit, Nunavut have fewer than 100 defense team members. These locations are considered isolated posts, which makes recruitment challenging. Northern premiers have all identified the need for careers and opportunities for Northerners. All files for Northern applicants for the CAF should be prioritized. Public affairs capacity is critical to the Arctic. JTFN should be a team of 4. However, as of last week, it has only 1 photographer. Therefore, images without proper aligned messaging will not adequately articulate the Government of Canada's intentions. JTFN is also a low priority for staffing with critical gaps across the headquarters. It is approximately 35% of its middle managers, junior officers, and senior NCOs are vacant, and this is a 15% more than the national average. And consider that they are trying to coordinate Nanook's year-round activities, engagements with other government departments, with our allies, with Indigenous governments, and designated individuals. If the Government of Canada could do one thing that would benefit the entire government, resourcing to accelerate security clearances might be that one thing. Turning to the Rangers, they are vital to the Arctic. That they are not combat capable does not take away from their incredible contribution. They are the eyes and the ears in the Arctic, but they need to be resourced with additional administrative personnel in their Yellowknife headquarters. Red tape to reimburse Rangers for claims against the Crown is still overly bureaucratic. And finally, I strongly urge the government to consider and articulate clearly what multi-purpose and dual use means for Canadians in an Arctic context. For example, the announcement of the Northern Operational Support Hubs, or NOSH, are very unclear as to purpose and function, and we're not sure what ends they will serve. It has not been the subject of a systematic assessment to identify the capacities that will contribute to operational support in the North. The CAF is not mandated to address the housing, medical services, and other vital deficits in the Arctic, but more personnel in the Arctic will put a greater strain on communities. I think now is the time for the Minister of Defense, the Minister for Northern Affairs, Transport, and other Arctic responsibilities to work in an integrated fashion to optimize the effects of public expenditure.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sharon. Dr. Bouteille, 3 minutes, please. Oh, Dr. Bouteille, we're not hearing you, unfortunately.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I hope you can hear me now. And let me commend you and your colleagues for this exercise. It's vitally important. I had a number of points, but let me, in fact, jettison most of them and make just a few in the 2 minutes that are left to me. I would suggest, without risk of being exceedingly blunt and rude, that we have become, sadly, a nation of sleepwalkers. When it comes to defense, we're naive, we're complacent, and we're entitled. And it's a state of affairs which is compounded by the abject failure of successive Canadian governments to provide real leadership on the issue of defense. We need some clear-eyed visions as to where the nation is going and a genuine sense of urgency. And in fact, that was one of the messages, I think, that emerged from the earlier part of your deliberations this morning. Time after time, there is no sense of urgency. Secondly, we are at war, and we should be acting and planning accordingly. Now, in my formal notes that I submitted to you, one of the issues that I raised is the conjunction between war and peace. And I would suggest, as outlined in the DPU, to some degree, what we have is a situation of unannounced conflict, and we should be acting accordingly as a nation. The DPU, to me, is a profound embarrassment. It's a hastily contrived Liberal Party electoral document full of truths, half-truths, and promises which, frankly, will probably never be fulfilled. It is a profoundly unsatisfactory statement. Arctic defense, and I deeply appreciate the professionalism and knowledge of Professor Charon, Arctic defense is, in my estimation, a national fantasy. It's convenient, it's logical in terms of our sovereignty, but it's a fallback position, and it's one to which, in point of fact, we provide lamentably few resources. We're in a race against time. If you are not ready, we'll lose. And I draw your attention to the huge array of inquiries that have been made, the commentaries on the state of Canadian defense. This is a true national crisis. And it's not sufficient simply to collect information and debate. We need genuine action. It will take a decade to begin to turn this situation around. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Boutet. Again, bells are going to start at 12:33. If I get 15 minutes on unanimous consent, we can run it to 12:48. Do I have a unanimous consent to continue through the bells? For 15, okay. That still means we're going to have to cut back time. 3 minutes, first round. Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Chair, because of how things are getting constrained here, I think it's unfair to our witnesses that we're cutting back on the amount of their time, especially with the testimony that they've given. They've had to cut that back. I don't think that's fair. So I move the following motion that I gave notice on last Monday. Given the large workload the committee has on the docket, the committee instructs the chair to book 5 meetings over the months of July 8th and September 13th to deal with unfinished business such as the Royal Canadian Air Force pilot recruitment, training, and retention, and other pressing matters as they emerge. May I speak to that motion?
You may. It's in order.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So as we are dealing with this DPU, and today's turned into a rush day, we know that we're probably going to lose the meeting on Wednesday with the visit of NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg. We got the DPU study that we want to dive into. We have a housing crisis, and was mentioned in our last panel that again we have 6,700 residential housing units that were short, and yet no money in the budget to back up the building of new houses for our troops. We have a housing study that we should be completing and getting tabled to provide insight to the government. We have a transparency study that we're also working on that needs to be dealt with. We have stories of our troops that are living unhoused and are rough. We have stories of our military families that are having to go to food banks. And through all this, we have this huge recruitment crisis that's just also, and I have another motion that I tabled last week that we'll deal with at another time, but on the pilot shortage that we are facing, especially with our fighter pilots not having enough to even fly the old aircraft we got, never mind the F-35s that are going to be coming on stream. So Mr. Chair, I don't think we need a lot of debate on this. I ask colleagues here to support this, to take time out of their summer to come back to Ottawa and allow us to put together policy that's going to help our Canadian Armed Forces put together policy that is going to provide better resources to those brave women and men who serve in the Canadian Armed Forces. And I think that the way we can do that is by having a few more meetings. 5 meetings out of our summer, I don't think is a big ask. I would ask colleagues to support this.
Ms. Lalonde.
I won't debate. I'm just going to say it's very interesting that this particular member is wasting time twice throughout this past 2 hours, so I would just call the vote.
No more debate. Those in favor of the motion? Opposed? Motion's defeated. Mr. Bazan, you have
3 minutes.
3 minutes. 2.5.
Okay. Thank you, and I want to thank both our witnesses, and I apologize that you're not going to get the amount of time that you deserve to put your concerns on, and we could have had more meetings to actually dive in deeper in what you're saying. I'm going to start with Dr. Battalier. You were unequivocal, and you pulled no punches in your criticism of this defense policy update. You're also quite well known for your advocacy for a strong Royal Canadian Navy. Can you talk to the fact that all the DPU talks about is exploring the importance of replacing our Victoria-class submarines and what Canada should be doing right now to get the underwater capabilities we need to defend our coastlines and to work with our allies?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Bazan. I certainly appreciate your question. The DPU does refer in a brief passage of half a dozen lines to some specific requirements with respect to underwater sensors and so forth in the Arctic and elsewhere on the Canadian coastline. That's one issue where the DPU is uncharacteristically specific. With respect to submarines, this is a national tragedy. Submarines are the coin of the realm, and we should be moving with enormous rapidity and commitment to address this issue. What we have to think about, without risk of getting into a long dissertation on submarines, is the colossal distances that separate us from the areas where we're likely to be operational. From Victoria to the Western Arctic is 4,500 miles, the same distance as from Victoria to Tokyo. The talk about conventional submarines, I think, is in many ways misplaced. We should, in fact, be going down the nuclear route. I realize the long legacy of nuclear submarines in the Canadian experience, but if you wish to proceed undetected, at speed, and to have the endurance to perform in the Arctic or elsewhere, this is the sort of submarine we need, and we should be buying it. We will have to buy it in collaboration with Americans and the Brits in the way that the Australians have done. So this is a matter of enormous urgency. A Navy without this capacity in this day and age, when there are over 200 submarines operational in the Indo-Pacific, is a Navy that is in fact operating with only half of the force it should be should have available.
Dr. Boutellier, I think it's Mr. Collins, is it?
Yes.
3 minutes, please.
Yep, thanks, Mr. Chair. Dr. Sharon, you caught my attention immediately with your opening statement when you said that you didn't believe that Canadian sovereignty is at risk. Can you did I hear you correctly, number one, and can you expand upon that?
Yeah, we're talking about de jure sovereignty. I mean, nobody is arguing that the Arctic is not Canadian. Even if we have Russian bombers that are in the Canadian Air Defense Identification Zone, that's still international airspace. That is not losing our sovereignty. And I think the problem with using a term like sovereignty means that we aren't talking about discussions of how do we detect threats, how do we defeat threats, how do we make sure that the whole of government is integrating their efforts. So it's the fact that sovereignty can be used by anybody to be sort of a short form for, I have a concern I can't articulate, but let me use sovereignty, rather than talking about the issues that need to be addressed.
Okay, let me follow that question up with, why do you believe now is the time then, even though it may not be in your mind related to sovereignty, Why is it now the time to invest in the Arctic?
Well, I've been arguing for a decade that we need to invest. I do a lot of research on NORAD, and the NORAD modernization and continental defense projects are going to be essential. We are in an era of deterrence by denial, which means we need to be able to get a common operating picture that can be shared securely with all of the necessary partners to understand what is happening. And that's not going to happen if the NORAD modernization projects, the satellites, the land-based, the sea-based sensors are not in place, connected, protected, and that we start to consider that the defense of North America is a wider contribution to NATO in general.
Thanks. You talked about the great strains that will come to communities in the north as it relates to investing $15.6 billion specifically in infrastructure to make that happen, right? We think about all of the roads that need to go in, the housing that needs to be constructed in order to have a greater presence in the north. And all of those investments need to happen in consultation, as you highlighted, with our partners and other stakeholders, including First Nations, our provincial and territorial partners. Can you talk about, in your mind, how that happens and the importance of having those conversations ahead of those investments?
Well, when it comes to the Indigenous governments, especially the Inuit, we're talking about rights holders. And so they absolutely have to be at the table. It's nothing about them without them. And this is where Joint Task Force North is so essential. They are the connectors for the Government of Canada to Indigenous governments, to other government departments. And with the increased tempo of activity that's happening in the Arctic, they need more resources to be able to make those connections so that consultations are significant, not ad hoc and after the fact.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Madame Normandin, 3 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. My questions are for Mr. de Boutier. In the previous panel, we heard that after 2029, this is the interpreter speaking.
I am sorry to interrupt you. Is there a translation available?
There should be. Dr. Boutillier, this is the clerk speaking to you. If you go to the bottom of your Zoom screen, there should be a globe that you can choose for interpretation. And if you choose English, it will give you the interpretation there.
Thank you so very much, Andrew.
Aucun problème. Est-ce que vous... No problem. Can you hear me now? Great, thank you. So my question is mainly for you. We heard from the previous panel that as of 2029, we can expect a drop in military expenses of GDP spent on defense as well, because it would be the end of those engagements that were taken under the other defense policy update. And do you share that view? And what does that mean in terms of our long-term expectations that we did commit to certain things with our NATO partners?
Thank you very much for that question. I apologize for not replying to you en français. To begin with, we have a lamentable inclination to freeload on our structural or institutional arrangements, particularly with the United States. And that, I would suggest, is a strategy which is rapidly becoming endangered. The Americans have significant challenges of their own in order to meet the defense demands of a global power. Secondly, I would suggest that all the evidence suggests that what we're looking at is a declining level of vitality in terms of the Canadian economy. Thirdly, at the very moment that we might begin to turn the corner, and there are some who would suggest that the decline in the armed forces is so profound that it is incapable of being reversed. There are some who would suggest that at the very moment that we begin to make real inroads in the deficits that successive governments have left us, we will in fact find ourselves without sufficient revenue to continue in the way that we have before. If you look, for example, at standards of living, we've fallen from 5th to 33rd globally. This is all a warning sign of our lack of competitiveness moving forward. So national defense is in real trouble, but it will be in even greater trouble if we don't move with enormous rapidity and urgency now. Thank you.
You have only about 15 seconds left.
Quickly, there have been cutbacks in maintenance to the tune of $1 billion. Is this something that we can really afford? And can we maintain these kinds of cutbacks?
No, we cannot maintain these. We're in a state of complete delusion and self-congratulation about our performance. When you look at the onset of the conflict in the Ukraine, we had more than 80 tanks, but in point of fact, probably less than 20 of them were actually available for service. And the same is true across a whole array of equipment in the Canadian forces. A lack of spares, a lack of personnel.
We're going to have, unfortunately, Dr. Bouteille, we're going to have to leave Madame Normandy's questions there. Ms. Madison, 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Professor Sharon, when you appeared at our Arctic security study, we spoke about the balance of confronting hostile states and yet still maintaining those diplomatic international agreements, relations. We spoke about calling out Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine while sanctioning them and then holding them within institutions like the Arctic Council. And we talked about that collaboration and those challenges. Last week, Minister Joly spoke about our approach to the Arctic. She spoke about the challenges of how those hostilities are making a change. Could you speak to how that's changed since we heard from you about on that study and how those changes have impacted things like the Arctic Council and our ability to continue in terms of that international space and that security space?
Well, in the case of the Arctic Council, the working groups have decided that they will proceed, but it will be online. One of the major concerns, of course, is that Russia is the largest Arctic territory, and we're seriously concerned that we do not have access to their data that speaks to how much methane is being released from permafrost that is melting, which is going to change the world's weather and climate change values. It's essential that we still work with scientists, work through diplomatic channels to make sure that we get that information. And this does not excuse their atrocious behavior, but we don't want to cut off our nose to spite our face. There are areas in which we absolutely must work with Russia. Again, that is not to say that we accept their egregious behavior, but at some point, we're going to have to find a way that we are going to be able to get this sorts of information because it's going to damage us.
Okay. We often, we're also completing and in the middle, I guess, of a study in terms of space defense. And similar to the Arctic, we're seeing that that commercialization, like the Arctic and space, and I certainly have concerns of that, given given the observations in terms of that diplomatic operation necessity and the fact that we are potentially cutting our nose off to spite our face. What do you suggest in terms of spaces we talk about, Russia, China, Iran, those really complicated situations?
Yeah, no, it is, and this is why having a global affairs is so
Sorry,
important.
Dr. Sharon, unfortunately you've been left 13 seconds to respond to that complicated situation. I'm going to, I think I'm going to be a little arbitrary here. We've got, we have to rise at 12:50. My thought would be a 1-minute round for each party and call it a day. So is that acceptable or otherwise? It would be Mr. Allison, 1 minute.
All right, I think, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure. To Dr. Beaulieu, a question for you. You talked about a bit of a fantasy that we could ever hit some of these targets. when it comes to our defense of our Arctic, just very quickly in the 45 seconds you have, what should we be prioritizing right now? Give us 2 or 3 things to start to do this rebuild.
Personnel and equipment. Those are the 2 things that you've got to move forward with lightning speed. We are 10 years behind the curve because of dithering, delay, and this is what we have to do. Only with those can we even begin to contemplate having a real presence in the Arctic.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Allison. Ms. Lambropoulos, 1 minute.
Thank you, Chair, and I'd like to thank our witnesses. Ms. Sharon, this question is for you. You spoke about the Rangers and the need to invest more in administrative personnel in order to help them, I guess, increase their capacity and their capabilities. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to the importance of that. It's not the first time we hear that in this committee.
Yeah, well, they are the eyes and ears in the Arctic. I'll note that any incursion that has happened in the Arctic, it has been the locals who have noted it, including submarines, and brought it to the attention of Government of Canada. So what we want them to be is out on the land, being those eyes and ears, and not trying to struggle with PDF versions, with wonky internet, and filling out complicated forms again and again and again, and then waiting for months for reimbursement, because in most cases they use their own equipment. And so you can imagine if a snowmobile, for example, is damaged, that doesn't mean that the Rangers can't use it. That means also that the Ranger themselves can't use it, their family can't use it, the community can't use it. So we really need to have northern appropriate responses to dealing with these administrative burdens.
Thank you, Ms. Lambropoulos. 1 minute, Madame Normandine.
Merci, Monsieur Boutier. Thank you, Mr. Boutier. It took several years for the new defense policy update to come in. It's saying that there's going to be a consideration, the exploration of a potential purchase of major equipment like submarines. Would it have been better not to say anything than to sound not credible in this way?
I'm terribly sorry. Your translation didn't come through at all. I apologize.
Okay, do you want to? Apparently, the translation didn't come through at all. You're still on the English translation, Dr. Boutier?
Yes. I am a D.
Okay, let's go at that again.
I can try again. Mr. Leboutier. Thank you. So it took 2 years to have a new defense policy update or security update that refers to the potential of exploring the purchase of major equipment like submarines. Wouldn't it have been better to just say nothing to that effect rather than to seem non-credible in terms of these purchases?
It is a profoundly disappointing document. It's a Hail Mary effort by the Liberal Party, suddenly panicked by the realization that so many Canadians now consider defense and security an electoral issue, to address the shortcomings in defense. And much of it is not worth the paper it's written on because it's pitched into 10 or 15 years into the future. So I would say in conclusion that one of the things that concerns me about the committee is the partisanship. Use the Australian model, which is bipartisan. You've got to move ahead as an entire nation. And in terms of the DPU, it would have been far better to have thought the thing through rather than to have rushed it out as part of the whole electoral process, because it's deeply unsatisfactory.
Thank you, Ms. Normandine. Ms. Matheson, final minute.
Mr. Boutier, in June 2022, you wrote that Canada is a nation adrift in the Indo-Pacific, and that needs to change. So the government came out with the IPS, but it seems to it has changed. In fact, since then, the government recognized foreign interference from Modi's government, but the DPU also brought smaller focus on the Pacific region. So looking back on that in terms of the last maybe 2 years, how do you think Canada should have approached the region differently?
we're talking about the Indo-Pacific region. When I wrote a critique of that, I suggested that it was aspirational and ambitious, but 40 years late. In fact, we have come to the Indo-Pacific after the action has largely taken place. If we're having challenges meeting our responsibilities in NATO, we are in no position to fulfill our responsibilities in the Indo-Pacific, much to my deep regret. And we should be in a position to do so if we find ourselves, in fact, drawn in the future into supporting, for example, American operations in the region. We have a huge deficit to make up simply reputationally in the region, let alone in terms of our capacity. The IPS dedicated us to moving ships into the region, but the Navy will be at extreme difficulty in terms of sustaining that over the next half decade.
Thank you, Ms. Manson. Unfortunately, that brings our time to a close. I just wanted to thank both of you for your patience. This is a unsatisfactory way to deal with an important policy document, but it is what it is, and we are in the time we are. Before I bring the gavel down, I just want to take note that this is the final time that Mr. Fillmore will be with us. And I just wanted to thank him for his contribution to the committee. But he may not be mayor yet, but he is resigning. So thank you.